It's the real news. I'm Aaron Mate. A new piece in foreign policy is called The End of Foreign Aid as We Know It. It says, quote, President Donald Trump's vow to put America first includes a plan to drastically cut assistance to developing countries and merge the State Department with USAID. Joining us to discuss is Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who served as Secretary of State Colin Powell's Chief of Staff under President George W. Bush. He's now an adjunct professor at the College of William & Mary. Colonel, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So these cuts were a part of President Trump's controversial budget proposal, but haven't gotten that much attention. What can you tell us about them?
I can tell you that this is just a continuation. It's not necessarily something new. It's a continuation of Jesse Helms in North Carolina when Jesse was still alive. God rest his soul, I ought to say probably, but I won't. Jesse wanted to do away with the State Department. In lieu of that, he settled for the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency essentially being dismembered and put into the State Department. And even more formidably, the U.S. Information Agency being dismantled and put into the State Department, where both have become rather innocuous creatures in terms of getting anything real done in the world. Jesse, in other words, neutralized them by doing that. That's what they're trying to do with USAID. They're trying to neutralize it by putting it in the State Department and making it just another bureau, if even that, an office in the State Department. It's already been emasculated. USAID is mostly contractors and subcontractors now because it's been so emasculated by budget cuts and so forth. Let's just look at this issue of foreign affairs and money, the 150 account at State Department. It is so minuscule. It is such a tiny part of the U.S. overall budget that one feels almost like skulking away if one is an American and is in some place like Paris or Toronto or Ottawa or any other place where per capita wise and GDP wise, they give far more to foreign aid purposes than we do.
Andrew Natsios, who was the administrator of USAID under President George W. Bush, he called these cuts to USAID and folding it within state, he called it an unmitigated disaster for the longer term.
In the longer term, he's right. It's a reflection of what we're doing generally. We believe that hard power, meaning at the forefront, military power, like the TLAMs that slammed into the Syrian air base recently, and its complement, financial and economic sanctions, are the way we should be doing business in the world. Rather than diplomacy, rather than foreign aid, rather than the kinds of things that win you friends and influence in the world, we are making ever more enemies.
But, you know, there are times when, at least rhetorically, the conservative isolationists can intersect with left-wing anti-imperialists. And I can imagine some people on the left saying, well, you know, maybe it's good that we're cutting funding to state because for decades it's been a tool of U.S. empire, you know, pointing to places like Cuba and Haiti where the U.S. State Department has worked to destabilize the governments there. What do you respond to
My
that?
response to that would be they're absolutely right when it comes to the 20 million or so that was going towards Cuban dissidents, as it were, and trying to destabilize Cuba, although I know where that money was really going. Most of that money was going to a jobs program for Cuban Americans in Dade County, Miami, and elsewhere in the United States. So that was kind of a, you know, I pay you, you vote for me deal there. But right, if it's being used for purposes that are not necessarily conducive to the American image in the world, the American reputation in the world, and ultimately to American power. But by and large, they're wrong because what's doing far more damage to us is that military budget. What's doing far more damage to us is the support and use of hard power rather than the soft power. I'll take even the percentage of soft power that's used badly, like that 20 million to Cuba, to all the money that's being used that creates actions in the world, like the cruise missiles going into Syria, for example, like the drone strikes happening in 7 or 8 countries now, like the deployment of American hard power around the globe. I'll take that soft power misuse to that hard power use any day, because that hard power use is what's causing us to lose respect, causing us therefore to lose real power all around the globe today. And mark my words, the world will only tolerate it for so long. We are 300 million some people. We're about 5-6% of the world population. There are 6.5 plus billion other people out there that compose this world. Sooner or later, they'll take care of the hegemon that gets out of control.
So let's zoom in a bit on what is being targeted here. This is from Foreign Policy. USAID estimates that it might have to eliminate 30 to 35 of its field missions overseas while cutting its regional bureaus by roughly 65%. They also say that health programs abroad are set to take an approximately 25% in funding. You know, when I read that, obviously, I think about what that means for vulnerable populations that might have been helped by these aid programs. And then, of course, you have the bigger problems, the wider problems of pandemics like Ebola, and what cutting USAID and other foreign health programs might mean for that, devastating issue.
The whole Trump campaign's approach to science and to analytical thinking and to critical thinking, to me, is a drawback to the dark ages. I realize that we're responding to that 15 to 20% of America who would love to draw back to those dark ages and carry their women by their hair and their guns back with them. I realize that that's what Trump is speaking to in many respects, that hardcore, masochistic, racist group of people in the center of the group that voted for him. But at the same time, I don't think that represents the bulk of Americans. I don't think it represents even 60%, even 50%, even 40% of Americans. So we have to ask ourselves, are the things that we're doing, are the cuts that we're making, are the things that you just described, for example, going to redound to our discredit and to our disinterest in the future, whether it's pandemics or it's disease in general, or it's something more esoteric that we're not even thinking about right now, like cyber warfare, or like the kinds of conditions that we're creating in other countries that we were dealing with, for example, even in the George W. Bush administration. George W. Bush increased both the global fund and the U.S. fund for fighting HIV/AIDS astronomically compared to previous presidencies. These are things that are done in enlightened self-interest, if you will, because we realize what a pandemic of HIV/AIDS might mean for stability, for conflict, and so forth. You're looking at some of the other things that have the potential to do that too. You mentioned one of them, Ebola. You're right. We're cutting off our nose to spite our face.
You mentioned science. The budget would enact a sweeping cut to the roughly $1 billion the U.S. draws on for contributions to the Green Climate Fund, which helps countries deal with the impact of carbon emissions. As we wrap, you've worked with some very powerful people. You worked under the Bush administration. What is the attitude of those in power, those who you've worked with, towards vulnerable people around the world? Are they, when they can get behind cuts like this, is it indifference? Is it contempt? How do they see those people out there who need help but stand to receive even less of it?
I think the first thing you have to look at is where their priorities really are. Yes, there are some of them who are as crass as anyone I've ever met in my life, who do not give a farthing for anybody else other than themselves. But you have to look at how they're establishing their priorities. Look at where we do spend our money. We spend $600 billion on the armed forces of the United States every year. We spend 1.2 to 1.3 trillion on that nebulous entity called national security. That's throwing the nuclear weapons in, the Veterans Administration, Homeland Security, all the things that make up national security. So that's where our priority is. We are a national security state, period. We've been in that state building effort since 1945, and we've completed it. You might say we completed it on the back of 9/11. We are a national security state. That is what we live for. We do not live for our people. We do not live for making the world a better place. We do not live for infrastructure improvement here or elsewhere. We do not live to combat probably the most existential challenge we confront, planetary climate change. We live for national security. And that has all kinds of connotations to it. It means that Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and Grumman are the companies of choice. It means that the kinds of arms sales that go on around the world, that incidentally the Obama administration led every presidency since 1945 in total arms sales. It means we live for those kinds of things. We don't live for the lower priorities, if they're even priorities at all.
Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson served as Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell, now an adjunct professor at the College of William and Mary. Thank you, sir, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.